Olivia had spent her whole life believing that the scar on her face was a reminder of the house fire she had miraculously survived. But one day, while flipping through a newspaper, she stopped abruptly. What she saw on that page would exposing the dark secret her parents had hidden for years. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Brolin household, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. Olivia Brolin sat curled in the corner of the couch, a glossy magazine spread open on her lap. Her fingers traced the perfectly symmetrical faces of the models gracing the pages. Flawless skin, smooth contours, radiant smiles. A bitter knot formed in her stomach. They looked nothing like her. She shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the collar of her sweater as if it could somehow conceal what could never be hidden. The scar, a jagged, pale mark that ran from her forehead, across her nose and down her cheek, stood in stark contrast against her dark skin. 12 years old, and already she understood what it meant to be stared at, whispered about, avoided. The kids at school never let her forget. Monster, cursed, ugly, words thrown at her in hushed voices behind cruel giggles. She had stopped looking at herself in mirrors a long time ago. What was the point? No matter how much she wished, no matter how much she prayed, the scar would always be there. Her fingers absently brushed against it as she turned the page. Cosmetic surgery. The words leaped out at her, accompanied by dazzling before and after photos. Transformation stories, life-changing procedures. Olivia's pulse quickened. She had heard of these things before and seen the stories on TV. A few of the older girls at school whispered about it. Rich kids who would get nose jobs for their 16th birthdays, their parents treating it like a rite of passage. Maybe, just maybe, this could be her way out. A way to finally stop being the girl with the scar. She had brought it up before, once. Her mother, Mariam Brolin, had shut her down instantly. Absolutely not. There is nothing wrong with you, sweetheart. But Mom, no. End of discussion. Olivia had dropped it then, but the desire had only grown stronger. If they wouldn't listen, maybe she would just have to figure it out on her own. A sudden noise pulled her out of her thoughts. The rustling of paper, the sharp intake of breath. Olivia looked up just in time to see her mother standing near the front door, a newspaper clenched in her hands. Mariam's eyes flicked rapidly across the page, her fingers tightening, knuckles whitening. Then, without hesitation, she folded the newspaper in half, strode to the kitchen and tossed it straight into the trash. Something about it wasn't right. Mariam was not an overly emotional woman. She rarely reacted to things with such intensity. And yet, whatever she had just read had shaken her. Olivia closed the magazine and sat up. "What was that about?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Mariam turned sharply, too sharply. A forced smile flickered across her face. "Nothing important," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as if to brush off the moment entirely. "Just some ridiculous news." Olivia frowned. "Then why did you throw it away?" "I don't want that kind of negativity in the house." Mariam's voice was steady, but Olivia wasn't convinced. Anthony Brolin, Olivia's father, was crouched beside the kitchen counter, working on a stubborn cabinet hinge. He had been listening, Olivia could tell. He always listened, but like always, he kept his thoughts to himself. Mariam turned to Olivia, her smile returning in full force, too bright, too deliberate. "Don't forget your dermatologist appointment today," she reminded her. Olivia groaned inwardly. She had forgotten. "How much longer do I have to go to these appointments?" she muttered, sinking back into the couch. "They never do anything. The scar is still the same." Anthony finally spoke, his voice calm, steady. "It's helping, Olivia. Maybe not as fast as you want, but the treatments are making a difference." She rolled her eyes. Yeah, barely. And then, almost without thinking, she said it. Maybe I should just get cosmetic surgery or something. Silence. Her father's hands stilled on the screwdriver. Mariam's expression tightened, the light in her eyes flickering out. No. Her mother's voice was firm, unyielding. Olivia hesitated. But we are not discussing this, Mariam interrupted. You are 12 years old, Olivia. You don't need surgery. I saw a video about it, Olivia pressed. There are procedures, safe ones, even for kids. That's enough. Mariam's tone left no room for argument. Olivia clenched her fists. It wasn't fair. Why did they get to decide how she lived her life? They didn't have to walk through school hallways with people staring. They didn't have to hear the whispers, the cruel laughter. Her mother sighed, pressing a hand to her forehead. Olivia, these things are expensive. If we could afford it. She stopped abruptly, exchanging a glance with Anthony. But it wasn't just about money. Olivia could feel it. They didn't want her to change. Why? Why did they want her to keep the scar? A strange, uneasy feeling settled in Olivia's stomach. But before she could press further, Mariam grabbed the dish towel and turned away. Go get ready for your appointment, she said, her voice suddenly light again, as if the conversation had never happened. We don't want to be late. Olivia knew a dismissal when she heard one. She pushed herself off the couch, glancing toward the kitchen trash bin where the newspaper lay, crumpled beneath scraps of last night's dinner. She didn't know why, but something about it felt important. Something about it felt like it was meant for her. Without another word, she turned and made her way upstairs, her mind already racing. She would go to the appointment, but more than anything, she needed to get her hands on that newspaper. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and fresh coffee. Olivia sat stiffly in the corner, her hand scrolling through her phone, though she wasn't really looking at it. The soft murmur of conversation, the rhythmic tapping of the receptionist's keyboard, and the occasional scrape of a chair on the tile floor filled the space around her. She hated these visits. Every month, the same routine, sit under the harsh white light. Let Dr. Robinson ran his fingers over her scar, listening as he muttered medical jargon that always seemed to lead to the same conclusion. There's progress, but it will take time. She already knew that. But how much time? A door creaked open, and a nurse peeked her head out. Olivia Brolin? She sighed, closing the magazine and tucking it under her arm as she stood. Her mother, Mariam, gave her a reassuring pat on the back. It'll be quick, sweetheart, she said. I'll be right here when you're done. Olivia wasn't so sure about that. Mariam never went in with her. She always waited outside as if she didn't want to hear the doctor's words herself. Dr. Robinson's office was exactly as Olivia remembered. Clinical, stark, smelling of alcohol wipes and something vaguely metallic. The doctor, a tall man in his 50s with thin silver glasses and a neatly trimmed beard, smiled warmly as she entered. Good to see you, Olivia, he said, gesturing for her to take a seat on the examination table. She climbed up, her legs dangling over the edge. How's the scar feeling? The same, she answered flatly. Dr. Robinson nodded, scribbling something on his clipboard. Then, as he always did, he adjusted the overhead lamp and leaned in, carefully inspecting her face. Olivia sat still, used to the feeling of his gloved fingers pressing against her skin. It's healing well, he murmured. The tissue is softer than before, and the discoloration has faded slightly. She clenched her jaw. But it's still there. Dr. Robinson looked at her over the rim of his glasses. Yes, he admitted, it is, but with time and continued treatment, we can minimize its appearance even more. Olivia swallowed the lump in her throat. That wasn't what she wanted to hear. The doctor straightened and moved to his desk, pulling up a series of images on his computer screen. "Let me show you something," he said, clicking through a timeline of photographs. Olivia leaned forward, her eyes scanning the images. They were all of her, taken at various stages throughout the years. The earliest one was from when she was 3 years old, a much younger version of herself, staring blankly into the camera. The scar still fresh and raw. She frowned. Something about the picture gnawed at her. "Where are the ones from before this?" she asked. Dr. Robinson paused, adjusting his glasses. "These are the earliest ones I have from when you first became my patient," he said. "Your parents brought you in around this age." Olivia nodded slowly, but an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. She had never seen a single baby picture of herself. Not one, not on the walls at home, not in the family albums. The only images of her that existed were from after she was 3 years old. And suddenly, she wasn't sure if that was normal. She took a deep breath, deciding to ask something that had been lingering in the back of her mind for a long time. "If my scar came from a house fire," she said carefully, "why is it only on my face?" Dr. Robinson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "That's an interesting question," he said. "Most survivors of house fires do tend to have burns in multiple areas, depending on how the fire spread. It's unusual to have such a distinct injury in only one place." Olivia felt her pulse quicken. She thought back to the way her parents always explained it, how she had been lucky, how the fire had barely missed the rest of her. It had never made sense before, and now it made even less sense. She remembered something else too, something her father, Anthony, had once said when she had asked why her skin was black when both he and Mariam were white. "Sometimes rare genetic mutations happen," he had told her. "They can affect pigmentation in ways people don't expect. It's uncommon, but not impossible." At the time, she had accepted the answer without question. Now, she wasn't so sure. The session ended with Dr. Robinson prescribing another round of creams. But Olivia barely listened. Her thoughts were tangled, restless. By the time she left the clinic, her mother was waiting for her outside, smiling as if nothing had happened. "All done?" Mariam asked brightly. "Yeah," Olivia muttered. Mariam didn't press further. She rarely did. As they stepped out onto the street, Olivia noticed a small kiosk near the clinic, its shelves lined with newspapers and magazines. A sudden impulse made her veer toward it. "I want to grab something to read," she said quickly before Mariam could stop her. Her mother hesitated, but nodded. "Just be quick." Olivia skimmed the papers absent-mindedly, flipping through pages filled with politics and business news, things she didn't care about. Then her eyes landed on a section she had never paid attention to before: missing persons. Faces stared up at her, each one frozen in time, attached to a name, a desperate plea for information. Her fingers flipped past them mechanically until they stopped. A face. A girl. Dark skin. Black, curly hair. A girl who looked exactly like her, except for one thing. No scar. Her breath caught in her throat. Bella Clark, missing for 10 years. Her heart pounded as she read through the details, taken from a park. Age 3, last seen wearing a yellow dress. Olivia's head spun. This was crazy. It had to be a coincidence. And yet, she reached for her phone and quickly copied down the contact number listed at the bottom of the page. She didn't know why. She didn't know what she expected. But something deep inside her whispered that she needed to keep this number. As she walked back to her mother, the newspaper still in her hands, her mind raced with possibilities. On the way to school, Olivia barely registered the sound of her mother's voice, the words blending into the hum of the car engine and the distant chatter of pedestrians. The morning felt heavier than usual, the minutes dragging slower than she ever remembered. In class, the teacher's voice was nothing more than background noise, the scribbles in her notebook meaningless. Even at lunchtime, a moment she usually looked forward to rushing to Layla's classroom, laughing over their meals felt distant, unimportant. Her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a whirlwind of unanswered questions and a truth she wasn't ready to face. The bus ride home was the same as always. The steady hum of the engine, the low chatter of students, the occasional burst of laughter from a group in the back. Olivia kept her head down, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window, hoping just this once she could fade into the background. A whisper, a snicker, then the inevitable. "Hey, Scarface!" Her stomach tightened. She didn't turn around. Maybe if she ignored them, they'd get bored. A rough shove against her shoulder. "I'm talking to you." Olivia closed her eyes for a second before forcing herself to remain calm. She had learned that showing emotion only made things worse. Slowly, she turned her head. Cody Jensen, the worst of them. Blonde hair, freckled face, a smirk that made her skin crawl. He wasn't alone. His usual followers sat beside him, Ben, Trevor, and Emily. They were all grinning, waiting to see how this would play out. "What do you want?" Olivia asked, keeping her voice even. Cody pretended to think for a moment. "I don't know. Maybe you should tell us what it's like being so—" He dragged the word out, enjoying every second of it. "Ugly." Ben and Trevor laughed. Emily giggled behind her hand. Olivia's fists clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She had heard it all before. Every insult, every cruel joke. And yet, it never hurt any less. Cody leaned in closer, lowering his voice, but making sure everyone around them could still hear. "Maybe your parents should have just left you in that fire." Something inside Olivia snapped. Before she could stop herself, she turned fully, staring him down. "Maybe your parents should have taught you some manners." A ripple of ooze spread through the bus. Cody's smirk wavered. Then, just as quickly, his expression hardened. "You think you're funny?" he sneered. And then, before Olivia could react, his hand shot out. A sharp sting exploded across her cheek as Cody's palm smacked against her scar. Pain flared instantly, radiating down to her jaw. The shock of it stole her breath. The laughter stopped. For a brief moment, there was only silence. Then, the bus driver's voice cut through the air. "Hey! Knock it off back there!" Cody leaned back in his seat, still smirking. Olivia swallowed hard, blinking away the burning in her eyes. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't cry. The bus slowed as it neared her stop. She forced herself to stand, ignoring the dull throb on her cheek. The doors hissed open. And then, to her surprise, "Olivia!" Her father's voice. Anthony Brolin stood at the curb, arms crossed, eyes scanning the bus. The moment he saw her face, his expression darkened. She barely had time to step off before he was beside her, his hand gently brushing against her cheek. "What happened, honey?" She hesitated. Telling him would only make things worse. "Nothing," she muttered, stepping past him. "Can we just go home?" Anthony's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The ride home was quiet. Olivia pressed her fingers against her face, feeling the raised skin of her scar, now warm and throbbing. But the ache in her chest was worse. Her life had always felt unfair, but today it felt unbearable. She was tired of being different, tired of never knowing why she felt like she didn't belong. Inside, Anthony guided Olivia to a chair at the dining table before heading to the kitchen. A moment later, he returned with an ice pack wrapped in a soft towel. Carefully, he pressed it against her cheek, his eyes clouded with worry and barely restrained anger. "I'm so sorry this happened to you, Key," he said quietly. "Those kids had no right to treat you like that." Olivia nodded, wincing as the cold pack touched her bruised skin. The chill was soothing, but it did little to ease the deep ache in her heart. Years of being bullied, of feeling different and alone, all seemed to come crashing down at once. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why does this always happen to me?" Anthony's expression softened. He reached out, his free hand gently clasping hers. "I wish I had an answer, sweetheart," he murmured. "But what I do know is that you're strong, you're brave, and you're beautiful, scars and all." "Don't call me beautiful," she muttered. "Every adult says that, but it's not true." Just then, Miriam rushed into the room, her face pale with concern. "What happened?" she asked, hurrying to Olivia's side. "I heard crying. Are you okay, honey?" As Anthony explained, Miriam's expression shifted from shock to anger, then to a deep, quiet sorrow. Kneeling beside Olivia's chair, she wrapped her arms around her daughter. "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, Olivia let herself sink into the warmth of her parents' presence. But as the initial shock of the incident began to fade, her mind drifted back to the doctor's office, to the newspaper article, to the questions that still lingered. Taking a steadying breath, she pulled away from her mother's embrace. Olivia rushed past her mother, heading straight for the kitchen trash bin. Empty. She spun around, her eyes locking onto Mariam, who stood frozen by the sink. "Where's the newspaper?" Olivia demanded. Mariam hesitated. "What newspaper? The one from this morning? The one you threw away." Her mother's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Then, "Oh, that." Mariam forced a laugh, waving a hand dismissively. It was just some nonsense article, nothing worth reading. Olivia's pulse pounded in her ears. "You're lying." Mariam flinched. "Excuse me?" "I saw your face when you read it." Olivia took a step closer. "You were scared." "That's ridiculous," Mariam said quickly, too quickly. "Then where is it?" Mariam hesitated for half a second too long. And Olivia knew. She didn't just throw it in the trash, she removed it from the house. Something was being hidden from her. That night, after her parents went to bed, Olivia sat on the edge of her mattress, gripping her phone tightly. There was only one person she could talk to about this. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a familiar name. Layla, her best friend, the only person she trusted. She pressed the call button. Layla picked up on the second ring. "Liv, hey, what's up?" Olivia didn't bother with small talk. "Something's wrong." Layla instantly sobered. "What do you mean?" Taking a deep breath, Olivia told her everything. The newspaper, the missing girl, her mother's strange reaction, the doubts that had been eating away at her all day. When she finished, there was silence on the other end. Then, "Olivia," Layla said slowly, carefully. "I think you need to call that number." Olivia's breath caught. "The one from the missing persons page." "Yes." Layla's voice was firm. "If you feel this strongly about it, you have to find out the truth." Olivia's hands trembled as she stared at the note she had scribbled earlier. The phone number. The name. Bella Clark. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. Could she really do this? Could she really make that call? She didn't know. But what she did know, she had to try. Her hands trembled as she hovered over her phone screen, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard outside her chest. "Maybe it's nothing," Layla had said over the phone earlier that evening. But what if it isn't? What if it wasn't? That question had been haunting Olivia, gnawing at her from the inside out. She had never believed in fate, never thought life had a way of leading people to the truth. But this felt too big, too strange, too impossible to ignore. Taking a shaky breath, Olivia began typing. "Hello, my name is Olivia Brolin. I saw the missing person notice in the newspaper, Bella Clark." She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the send button. If she sent this, there would be no turning back. But if she didn't, she would never know. With a final breath, she pressed send. She stared at the screen, waiting. Nothing. Minutes passed. Olivia exhaled, a mix of relief and disappointment washing over her. Maybe it had been foolish to think someone would answer. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe this was all just a ridiculous, desperate attempt to explain something unexplainable. But then, a vibration. A new message appeared on the screen. "Bella, is that you?" Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, rereading the words over and over again as if they would somehow change. But they didn't. A sudden noise from behind made her jump, her phone nearly slipping from her hands. "Who are you texting?" The sharp, demanding voice of her mother sliced through the air. Olivia spun around so fast her vision blurred. Mariam stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes dark and unreadable. For a split second, Olivia couldn't breathe. She had never seen her mother look like this before, so rigid, so cold, so angry. Mariam took a step closer. "I asked you a question, Olivia." Olivia swallowed hard, quickly locking her phone and clutching it to her chest. "No one," she lied. "Just Layla." Mariam's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let me see your phone." Olivia's pulse quickened. "Why?" "Because I said so." Olivia shook her head. "It's private." Mariam's expression darkened. "Olivia, I said no," Olivia snapped, stepping back. "Why do you care? Why are you acting like this?" Mariam's fingers twitched at her side. "You're hiding something," she said, her voice eerily calm now. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Olivia's voice cracked. Just leave me alone." Her mother exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, but after a long pause, she nodded. "Fine." She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, but Olivia didn't feel relief. She felt trapped. Mariam had never been like this before, never so aggressive, never so desperate to know what Olivia was doing. Why? And why now? Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Layla. "Are you okay?" Olivia stared at the words. She didn't know how to answer. Later that night, Olivia packed a bag. She needed to get out. Layla had insisted she come over, had practically begged her. "You don't sound okay," Layla had said. "Just come stay the night. My parents won't mind." So Olivia stuffed her essentials into a small backpack, some clothes, her phone charger, her school books, her mind running 100 miles per hour. She wasn't running away. She was just stepping away. Just for a night. As she slung the bag over her shoulder, she cracked the door open, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. Silent. Good. She moved carefully, creeping down the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. The front door was only a few feet away. Almost there. "Olivia?" Her mother's voice made her freeze. Olivia turned to see Mariam standing in the kitchen, holding a steaming cup of something warm. "Where are you going?" Olivia's mouth went dry. "Layla's. She invited me over." Mariam's expression didn't change. Then, to Olivia's surprise, she nodded. "All right," she said smoothly. "But before you go, have some tea. It'll help you sleep." She brought it to her lips, took a sip. It was warm, soothing, a little sweet. She set the cup down. "I should go." Mariam nodded again, stepping aside. Olivia walked to the door. She reached for the knob. Her vision blurred. Her fingers felt heavy. A deep exhaustion settled into her bones, spreading through her limbs like molasses. Her heart pounded as realization struck. No, 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 no. She turned to look at her mother, her mouth opening to say something, but her legs gave out beneath her before she could make a sound. The world tilted. Darkness swallowed her whole. The dim yellow glow from the small overhead light flickered slightly, casting wavering shadows on the wooden walls. A cold shiver ran down her spine as Olivia slowly opened her eyes, the unfamiliar surroundings making her stomach churn with unease. She wasn't at home. She wasn't at Layla's. She had no idea where she was. Her body felt sluggish. Her limbs weighted as if she had been sleeping for hours. She tried to sit up, but a pounding headache made her wince. Her mouth was dry, her throat sore. Something wasn't right. The last thing she remembered was standing at the front door, her bag slung over her shoulder, ready to leave. Her mother had stopped her, offering her a warm drink, her voice unusually soft, her eyes unreadable. Then, nothing. Her heart began to race as realization dawned. She had been drugged. Her fingers instinctively reached for her phone, but as she pressed the screen, nothing happened. No bars, no signal. The messages from Layla, she knew there must have been many, were left unread, lost somewhere in the void. A sharp noise made her snap her head up. Across the small space, Anthony and Mariam sat stiffly at the small table, their faces lined with tension, their hands clasped tightly together. Olivia had never seen them look like this before. Her father's usual warm gaze was distant, unreadable. Her mother's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her skirt. "What's going on?" Olivia's voice came out hoarse, unsteady. "Where are we?" Mariam let out a shaky breath. "We just needed some time away, sweetheart." Anthony nodded, though his fingers tapped restlessly against the table. Things were getting complicated at home. Complicated? Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "You drugged me," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. You took me away from home. Why?" A heavy silence followed. Her parents exchanged a glance, something unspoken passing between them. Then Anthony sighed, running a hand over his face as if bracing himself. "Because we had to," he said finally. Olivia's hands clenched into fists. "Had to? What does that even mean?" Another pause, another shared glance. And then the truth came, slowly, painfully, in a way that made Olivia wish she had never asked. "We're not your real parents," Mariam said, her voice trembling. The words hung in the air, suffocating, crushing. Olivia blinked as if hearing wrong. "What? We didn't." Anthony hesitated, swallowing hard. "We didn't take you. We bought you." The room tilted. Olivia's breath came fast, shallow, the walls of the camper suddenly too close, too tight. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible." But Mariam pressed forward, her eyes glistening with something that almost looked like sorrow. "You were 2 years old. We couldn't have children. We wanted a family, and when we were offered the chance to have you, we took it." The words made Olivia's stomach churn. Bought, not adopted, not rescued. Bought, like an object, like something owned. The taste of bile rose in her throat. Who did you buy me from?" Anthony's fingers tightened against the edge of the table. People who shouldn't have had you to begin with. You were taken, Olivia. Stolen. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. Her chest tightened, panic clawing its way up her throat. She thought of the missing persons page, of Bella Clark, the girl with her face but without her scar. The scar, a wave of nausea hit her. They had let her keep it, not out of neglect, not because they hadn't cared, but because they wanted her to be unrecognizable. She felt sick at the thought of them looking at her every day, knowing what they had done. Sick at the thought that they had let her grow up believing a lie. You let me think, her voice broke. You let me think I was your daughter. You let me think I was... You are our daughter. Mariam's voice was desperate, pleading. No, I'm not. Olivia's voice cracked raw with pain. She couldn't breathe. She needed air, needed space, needed to be anywhere but here. Her hands shot out, pushing off the blankets tangled around her legs as she scrambled off the cot. Her head spun, her balance wavering, but she forced herself upright. She moved toward the door, her fingers fumbling for the latch. Anthony was on his feet in an instant. Olivia, stop. She didn't. Olivia. A hand gripped her wrist, firm, unyielding. She yanked away. Don't touch me! She shrieked, her voice ragged, filled with a pain she couldn't contain. Her father flinched. Her mother let out a quiet sob. But Olivia didn't care. She turned back to the door, her fingers wrapping around the handle, twisting, pulling. It didn't budge. Locked. They had locked her in. Panic surged through her veins, hot and suffocating. She turned back, chest heaving. You can't keep me here. Anthony's face was grim. We're not keeping you here. We're keeping you safe. Safe? Safe from who? Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She refused to let them see her break. Her entire life had been a lie, and she would never forgive them for it. The dim glow of the camper's interior cast long shadows across the walls, flickering as the small overhead lights swayed with the breeze outside. Olivia sat stiffly on the thin mattress, her mind racing despite the heavy fog that still clung to her thoughts. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to act as if nothing was wrong. If they suspected she was planning to run, they would never let her out of their sight. Mariam was sitting at the small built-in table, her fingers absent-mindedly tapping against the wood, while Anthony stood near the tiny kitchenette, rummaging through a cabinet. They weren't looking at her. This was her chance. Slowly, she shifted, placing her feet flat on the cold floor. She stood up, wobbling slightly, pretending to steady herself against the wall. I just need some air, she murmured, keeping her voice neutral, making it sound like she was still groggy. I feel sick. Mariam's eyes flickered toward her, narrowing slightly, but after a beat, she nodded. Don't go far. Olivia gave a slow nod, suppressing the scream rising in her throat, the desperate urge to bolt. She reached for the handle of the camper door, her fingers curling around the cool metal. As soon as she felt the latch give way, she took a deep breath and wrenched it open, shoving herself forward with every ounce of strength she had left. The moment her feet hit the damp earth outside, she ran. The cold night air burned in her lungs, her vision still slightly blurred, but she pushed forward, forcing her legs to move, to carry her as fast as possible away from the camper, away from them, away from the lies. The dense forest closed in around her, tree branches clawing at her skin as she stumbled over roots and uneven ground. Behind her, she heard shouting, Mariam's frantic voice, Anthony's heavy footsteps, but she didn't dare look back. She had no idea where she was going. The only thing she knew was that she had to keep moving. Her heart pounded in her ears, her pulse a steady drumbeat of fear and determination. Then, through the thick tangle of trees, she saw it, a small wooden building with a dim porch light glowing against the darkness. A cabin. No, something else. She pushed forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and as she neared, she saw a sign near the door. Campground Office. Hope surged through her like a second wind. She stumbled up the wooden steps, her fists slamming against the door. "Help!" she gasped, her voice hoarse. "Please, someone help me." A rustling sound came from inside, followed by the creak of the door as it swung open. A man in his 60s, dressed in a heavy flannel shirt and worn jeans, stood in the doorway. His lined face creased with confusion, then concern as he took in the sight of her, wild-eyed, breathless, her clothes torn from the underbrush. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "They took me," Olivia choked out, gripping the doorframe for support. "They're not my real parents. They kidnapped me. Please, you have to call the police." The man's face darkened with alarm, his eyes darting past her toward the forest. He didn't hesitate. He reached for a phone sitting on the nearby desk, his fingers moving quickly over the keypad. "Stay right here," he said. "I'm calling 911. A rush of relief flooded Olivia's body, so overwhelming that her legs nearly gave out beneath her. She clung to the doorframe, her breath shaky as she listened to the man speak. "Yeah, I've got a young girl here saying she's been kidnapped. We're at Pine Hollow Campgrounds. Get someone out here fast." A sudden crash echoed from the woods, followed by the sound of footsteps, fast, frantic. Olivia turned just in time to see figures moving between the trees. Anthony and Mariam. They had followed her. "Get inside," the man ordered, his voice sharp. He stepped in front of her, blocking her from view as he peered into the darkness. "Don't come any closer," he shouted. "The police are on their way." For a moment, there was silence. Then, without a word, the shadows shifted. Olivia saw them turn, saw the glint of her father's pale face in the moonlight before they vanished into the forest. They were running. Sirens wailed in the distance. The night pulsed with flashing red and blue lights as the police cars finally arrived, their headlights cutting through the dark. Officers rushed out, their voices firm, controlled, demanding answers. The campground manager quickly relayed what had happened, while another officer guided Olivia toward one of the cars. "You're safe now," the officer said gently, his eyes filled with quiet reassurance. Safe. The word barely felt real. Olivia sank into the back seat of the patrol car, her body trembling, exhaustion crashing over her all at once. She was safe. They believed her. Someone had finally believed her. The police station was colder than Olivia expected. The walls, painted a dull shade of grey, felt distant and unwelcoming, the air thick with a mixture of coffee and old paper. She sat stiffly in a chair too big for her, her fingers gripping the edges of her sleeves as she tried to steady her breath. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of a ceiling fan and the distant murmur of voices beyond the closed door. Across from her, an officer, Detective Harris, his badge red, studied her with calm, assessing eyes. He was an older man, his salt and pepper hair cropped short, his expression unreadable. He had been patient, listening as she recounted everything, every doubt, every suspicion, every strange inconsistency in the story her parents had told her. She spoke of the scar on her face, the absence of any baby pictures before the age of 3, the odd way her mother had reacted to the newspaper, and, most of all, the photo of the missing girl who looked exactly like her. When she finished, there was a long pause. Olivia could hear her own breathing, uneven and shallow, as she waited for him to speak. Finally, Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "All right, Olivia," he said, his voice steady. "I need you to stay here while we check a few things." She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs as he stood and left the room. She was alone now, her thoughts racing. Was she wrong? Had she made a mistake? Had she just destroyed her family over nothing? Minutes passed, then an hour. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. Then the door opened. Another officer entered, carrying a file. He set it on the table, flipping through its pages before glancing up at her. "Olivia," he said carefully, "we found something." Her stomach twisted. "There are inconsistencies in your records," he continued. "Your birth certificate was issued when you were 3 years old. Before that, there's nothing." She felt like the floor had been ripped out from beneath her. "We ran a check through our missing persons database," the officer went on. "Your description matched a case from 10 years ago, Bella Clark, taken from a park when she was 2 years old." The words barely registered. She gripped the edges of the chair, struggling to breathe, her mind refusing to accept what she was hearing. Then the officer's voice softened. "Olivia, we contacted Evelyn Clark." The name sent a chill down her spine. "She's on her way." The next half hour passed in a blur. Olivia sat motionless, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. She didn't know what to feel. Then the door opened again, and she saw her. A woman stood there, frozen in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. She had dark, curly hair, just like Olivia's. Her skin was the same warm shade of brown, and her eyes, wide, glistening with unshed tears, were identical to the ones Olivia saw in the mirror every day. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the woman took a trembling step forward. "Bella?" she whispered. Olivia couldn't answer. The woman let out a shaky breath, covering her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh my God!" she choked, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe it. "It's you!" She rushed forward, dropping to her knees in front of Olivia, her hands hovering hesitantly before finally resting on Olivia's shoulders. "I've been looking for you," she sobbed. "For 10 years. I never stopped." Something inside Olivia cracked. She didn't know when she started crying, but suddenly she couldn't stop. Evelyn pulled her into a tight embrace, her body trembling against Olivia's. For the first time in her life, Olivia felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't even realized was missing. Family. Real family. The moment was broken by the arrival of another officer. "We'll need to conduct a DNA test," he said gently, "just to confirm." Evelyn nodded, wiping at her eyes. "Of course," she whispered. The test was simple, a quick swab, nothing more. Olivia barely processed it. Her mind was too full, her emotions too tangled. An hour later, the results came back. The officer re-entered the room, holding a sheet of paper. He looked at Olivia, then at Evelyn. "It's a match," he said. "Your sisters." The confirmation sent Evelyn into another round of quiet sobs. She turned to Olivia, her hands gripping hers tightly. "I'm taking you home," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've waited so long for this day. You don't have to be alone anymore." Olivia wanted to feel relief. She wanted to feel joy. But all she felt was numb. Her entire life, everything she thought she knew, had been shattered in a single night. The sound of sirens still echoed in Olivia's ears as she stood outside the police station, watching the flashing red and blue lights cast distorted shadows on the pavement. Inside the station, through the glass-paneled doors, she could see Anthony and Mariam, their hands cuffed behind their backs, their faces pale and drained of all the certainty they once carried. Officers flanked them on either side, leading them down the hall toward the holding cells. Olivia's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She had thought this moment would bring relief, that seeing them brought to justice would somehow make all the anger and confusion dissipate. But as she stood there, watching them disappear from view, all she felt was a deep, hollow ache in her chest. They had lied to her. They had stolen her from the life she was meant to have. And yet, they had also raised her, clothed her, held her when she cried, taught her how to ride a bike, how to tie her shoes, how to navigate the world. She hated them. She loved them. She didn't know which feeling was stronger. A voice broke through her thoughts. "You don't have to watch," Evelyn said softly. Olivia turned to look at her sister, the woman who was still so unfamiliar and yet, in some inexplicable way, felt like home. But Olivia couldn't look away. She needed to see this. She needed to know that everything was real, that there was no going back. The investigation into her abduction had revealed horrors far worse than anything she had imagined. Anthony and Mariam, in their desperate longing for a child, had unknowingly become part of something much darker than they had ever understood. They had bought her from a man who had stolen children, not just for families like the Brolins, but for people with far more sinister intentions. Some children had been trafficked overseas, their fates unknown. Others had been forced into labor, treated like property, until their bodies gave out from exhaustion and neglect. Olivia had been one of the lucky ones. The thought made her stomach turn. When Anthony and Mariam were questioned, they had given up the name of the man who had sold her to them. That single piece of information had led authorities to an entire operation, a network of criminals who had torn families apart for profit. Olivia had never considered herself special, but in that moment, she realized that simply surviving had made her an exception. A week later, in the cold, impersonal setting of a courtroom, Olivia sat in the witness stand. The judge's voice rang out in the high-ceilinged chamber, listing the charges against the people she had once called her parents. The prosecution detailed the crimes, the deception, the stolen years. And then, when the judge asked if she had anything to say, Olivia did something no one had expected. She asked for leniency. "I know what they did was wrong," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "But they didn't hurt me. They didn't buy me to use me or to sell me again. They raised me like their own child. They gave me a life when they could have abandoned me like so many others were abandoned. I don't think they deserve freedom, but I also don't think they deserve to be treated like monsters, because they weren't." Mariam wept into her hands. Anthony, his shoulders trembling, looked up at her with pleading eyes. "Olivia, please, please forgive us." Olivia met his gaze, but she said nothing. She wasn't ready to forgive. Maybe she never would be. As they were led away, she watched them go, feeling nothing but a quiet, aching emptiness. She stepped outside the courthouse, the crisp afternoon air filling her lungs. Evelyn was waiting for her, standing near the steps, her dark eyes filled with something Olivia couldn't quite name. "Are you okay?" Evelyn asked. Olivia thought about it for a moment. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I will be." Evelyn nodded as if she understood. The two of them stood side by side, looking out at the city, at the sky, at the world that stretched endlessly before them. For the first time in her life, Olivia felt like she was standing on solid ground, not trapped in the shadow of a past she didn't understand. She reached out, hesitating for only a moment before slipping her hand into Evelyn's. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light over the cityscape. The wind carried with it the scent of something new, something just beginning. For the first time, Olivia felt free, and this time, she knew exactly who she was. And that, my friends, is the end of Olivia's journey, a story of deception, loss, and ultimately self-discovery. She spent years believing one truth, only to have her entire world unravel before her eyes. But in the end, she found something even more powerful than the life she thought she had. She found herself. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories that take you on deep emotional journeys. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep searching for the truth.